So now let's talk about the left and China. I'll just set up, I'll set up basically the parameters that I think, and then just get everybody's thoughts on it. And as I keep saying, we'll keep doing a lot more coverage on this. It's very hard to find people on this, frankly. I think most of the people that come out of, and look, I think Steve Cook is awesome. He's a friend of mine. We obviously don't agree with everything, but he does really fascinating work. So I will talk to people aligned with the defense and intelligence, not directly those things, but I will talk with people aligned with think tanks and who have strategic biases, certainly with the Chinese government, certainly with the Europeans, with the Iranians, with the Saudis, with the US, with the Singaporeans. That's part of understanding global politics. But I will say a big hesitation I have about a lot of think tank and scholarship I'm seeing on China right now is it does follow extremely similar parameters. It's very saber rattling. It's very much sort of like it was cool when China was a big sweatshop, but China trying to develop their own 5G, their own the role in the world that they are just inevitably going to play is some type of a problem. And we're not going to do coverage like that. Mm-hmm. Now, I love interviewing, someone like Pepe Escobar, and who's brilliant, and I learn a lot from. Obviously, I think he's definitely much more sympathetic to the Chinese government than I am, I think. Although again, hopefully have him on again soon. I learned a lot from him. But I think that we have to figure out how to recognize that there is a emerging consensus. And go back in the archive a couple of months ago, we played that clip of Steve Bannon and Thomas Friedman having a love-in. And, they're so different. Steve Bannon's a nationalist and Thomas Friedman's a globalist. They were sitting there reading from the same songbook about how China's ripping the United States off and we need to partner with the corporate sector to hold China accountable, blah, 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 blah. So there's going to have to be a left pushback against a hypocritical, xenophobic, warmongering approach to China. Then there's going to need to be a third thing, which is the realist dimension of all of this, which is not making, and frankly, we need to do this more at times with the United States. How does something just work? Setting aside, you need to understand, and it's very hard to understand, and I would not trust most popular mainstream media presentation of how China actually works, whether positive or negative. I don't think we have in any way a deep understanding of the power balances there. We know that Xi has given himself more power relative to previous Chinese leaders, but we also don't know the coalition that allows him to do that. Mm-hmm. There's always a coalition of power. There's always, even the most caricatured place like North Korea has different variables in place to manage power. There's just no place in the world that doesn't work like that. And I don't think we have a very deep understanding of what those Chinese dynamics are or how they view their own foreign policy or what they're actually trying to create. And that's the objective domain that we have to study. Now, the third, we can acknowledge how many people they've lifted out of poverty. We can acknowledge the extraordinary hypocrisy in U.S. foreign policy. I've gotten the pushback and I've tried to read the sources, and I have not read anything that can convince me that it is not a form of state capitalism. Now, maybe if you want to say it's a state capitalism as part of a decades-long transition to communism and its plan, look, I think that's extremely optimistic and giving a nation state credit that I wouldn't extend to almost any nation state. But right now, as it is practiced, we're talking about state capitalism. And we're certainly talking about, even if we complexify different situations, obviously various forms of what we would call human rights abuses and an alternative to the internet and to communication, which there needs to be an internet to a contrast to Silicon Valley platform capitalism. I don't know if that alternative is emerging from China. So these are hard questions, and they're serious things that we have to explore. And we need to give, and be able to take all these things into account. But anyways, guys, please.
Yeah, I take the idea, I think, look, with any state, like any state, right, anywhere, same standard I would apply, the United States, any, places I'd be more sympathetic with, right? Anywhere. I think you have to judge state actors by what they do and not what they say. And if you're going to judge the Chinese state by what they do, I mean, I think, President for Life Xi is a little bit better at sort of using, at sort of coming up with Marxism flavored rationalizations, for what they do. But what they actually do is they preside over a state where the overwhelming majority of the economy is in private hands, right? I mean, like whatever you think about systems like China had in the 70s, it's not that, right? Like we just put that issue to one side, right? Overwhelming majority of the economy is in private hands. You certainly can't legally, it's organized a trade union to fight for better conditions, although people do a lot anyway. They might like students who read Marxist texts because it's part of the iconography of the state and then take it seriously and go out and help, workers who are trying to organize and strike or disappeared. So I think it is important to push back against the part of the left that sees China as any kind of like defensible model of society. I mean, I think that it's really important that it's not even just like a situation like Cuba where we could acknowledge undemocratic and authoritarian things, but like, wow, they're doing a lot of good things, right? It's not,
and it's also scale. I mean, Cuba just has a heroism to it that is, and also, again, context is not justification, but there is a bigger context upon which, those systems in Cuba have developed. So I think I agree. I think comparing Cuba and China is, look, maybe if you're looking at really specific things, it could be useful, but overall, that's apples and oranges there.
Yeah.
But wait, so you guys don't consider Foxconn factories in Wisconsin to be beachheads of communism?
I do not.
Yeah, it's socialism with suicide net characteristics. But look, the important thing is that you can walk and chew bubblegum here, right? All of that is totally compatible with saying that belligerence towards China and demonizing China is both bad and reactionary, as well as just being incredibly stupid, just given the realities on the ground of what any kind of conflict, even cold, much less hot, with China would look like in practice.
It's also not, just to say real quick, and it's not because you're trying to, I think Mark Ames had a good shot at somebody who had a kind of, very thoughtful, like, we need to oppose xenophobia and demonization, but we also need to speak honestly about the CCP. And Mark Ames kind of did look, this is actually a very fair point generally of like, right, great. Like, it was so important that everybody talked constantly about how horrible Saddam Hussein was to prove that you weren't a monster before the United States unleashed hell on Iraq and the wider Middle East after the hell it unleashed on Afghanistan. And I think there's a lot of truth to that point. I also think that, frankly, honestly, you didn't need to know a hell of a lot about Iraq or Saddam Hussein geostrategically to know that was a fucking nightmare, illegal, horrific thing. Mm-hmm. China is a presence in the world in both good and bad ways that just simply transcends, frankly, whether it's like a heroic experiment like Grenada that the United States suffs out, or, a kind of, a brutal, cruel authoritarian that used to be backed by the United States that the United States snuffs out. China is just a different thing. Well, and we can get into like, Belt and Road and all of these various things.
Well, I mean, I would just to piggyback off of that too. And I think, I'll call them, Ben, the literalist left, right? The people who it's like, oh, they say they're this, that means they're that, and I think that there's very serious, debate and discussion. I think that calling it like state capitalism as a way to like dissuade certain people from romantic ideas of it is useful. But I think that the Chinese system, it's so it's so complex, and there are a lot of forces involved in it that I think it just is difficult to define in a kind of like simple way like that, in a one-liner. And I think that's where people get tripped up, right? Because once you introduce complexity into it, people really just want the quick like moral judgment. Is this the good one or the bad one? And I think that that's where we've sort of fallen into this like really dangerous and short side discussion on the left, where it's just a constant fight between like, well, no, like, China's a right-wing state, or China is, the communist, utopia. I think that to hit on what you were just saying, Michael, too, like China's completely different, for example, than like, a system like what they had in Iraq, just in the sense of how embedded the Chinese Communist Party in that system is into communities across the state of China, right? It's not so like set up in a kind of like singular like patronage system.
Well, wait, David, this is an important point. You're saying that it isn't just like a central party, that there is some like regional variance in how the party governs, and there still are some models inside China that you can see in terms of like how they've done development, how they've done building projects, or whatever else that shows like a certain type of government, like it's not,
politics operates on a different scale there, right? Where it's
no question.
I mean, obviously on a scale because of the size of the country, but it just operates in a different theater than what we're traditionally used to seeing, right? Because it's operating within the party structure of the Communist Party. That's why, for example, Xi is very skilled. If you read Xi's manifestos, they're very interesting, especially for people who are like interested in Marxism, because they make a compelling argument like from the logic, right? That like this is the transition stage. Xi, for example, doesn't say that China is a communist state or even a socialist. It's actually like that they're just doing the managed capitalism to develop China into so it can have the social conditions for it to move into the next stage of socialism to communism. I guess what I'm trying to say fundamentally is it's just like it's a very complicated society. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about it. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be able to, criticize it. I just think that like the top line conversation that most people have about China has been sort of, it's just a caricature, and it hasn't developed to a deeper understanding, I think, on any side for what the state is.
I think no, Ben, go ahead.
Oh no, so I was going to say, I think, I think that's kind of a funny, rationalization. It's definitely taking like this important element of Marxist analysis of history, that you do need to build up capitalism to get socialism, and sort of doing an interesting bit of rhetorical jujitsu with that, I think I think that the germ of truth in the idea of China as a socialist society is that there is, despite the fact that most of the economy is privately owned, there is still a lot of state planning in the development of the economy. Like there's an interesting like way that's merged there. So, so state planning can be used to help the private economy develop much faster than it would otherwise. Although I think it's also important that judging them by their actions and really even like what you're quoting from Xi, like the sort of primary agenda of China, when you talk about like lifting people out of poverty and everything, I mean, that's true, but it's also in the way that early capitalism, as it developed, right, lifted a lot of people in feudalism out of poverty, just because industrialization, right, creates material conditions.
But at a world historic level, though, in China.
Yeah, totally, right? But
again, I mean, there's been a lot of poverty reduction in India by a kind of similar metric. Like it is I think on that level, it's just world historical, just purely because of the numbers, and they haven't.
And literally Taiwan, right, which is a good contrast case because that's a country that's run by the other side of the Chinese Civil War that led to the foundation of the PRC. But the development.
They also weirdly kept their word in a bizarre way. Like they were the dregs of this of the right wing Shanghai Shek army. Mm-hmm. They ran Taiwan as a dictatorship. They actually always said that they would eventually transition to democracy, and then they did. And now they sort of have like this moderate social democratic state it's interesting. But
yeah, but I was
Yeah.
going to say, like
Yeah.
the underlying agenda of all of this. I mean, I think it's important to recognize it's not like an egalitarian agenda of like equalizing society. It's a developmentalist agenda, which is the same as any developing nation. They're just better at it, right?
Yeah.
And actually, I was just going to say the larger context is one of the really interesting things in the Trump ad we watched earlier was he showed Biden saying China being prosperous is good for us, and the Trump response like, no, it's not. Right, we should want China to be poor and miserable, right? Like that's what we should want. And I think this is another place where it's important not to get trapped in the way this is usually talked about, because you can see in that little Biden clip and the Trump response to it, this way that this issue, and this doesn't just apply to China, it applies more generally, is generally thought of that either you should have this kind of nationalist, kind of old style mercantilist sort of worldview, like what Trump is promoting, that we're in some game where the United States can be prosperous or China can be prosperous, but not both, right? Or you have like a neoliberal perspective where you talk a lot about shared prosperity, but what you really mostly mean is shared prosperity for shareholders, right?
I also want to say
it's a socialist internationalist alternative to both of those.
Two quick things too. One is that there's a debate about how much what it's commonly accepted amongst people that are very excited about what's happening in China and want to and read Xi and look at the accomplishments, and also actually amongst the people in like the sort of mainline, Asia society kind of world that are very wary of what's happening in China, that Xi does really represent a break. And I've actually seen some kind of interesting pushback against that, which is, yes, of course, like certainly Xi cuts more of a figure than Hu Jintao, for sure. Although, I mean, Jiang Zemin was actually, a very different kind of guy, but actually a pretty well-known and very well-liked leader. And then before that, you had you had Deng Xiaoping. So, I mean, most of China, and obviously Mao, most of China's leaders have actually been these very charismatic figures that in very different ways have cut a really large figure on the global stage. And, one of the kind of arguments is that she is still like when Deng Xiaoping basically started instituting this slew of reforms in the 70s and 80s through the Tiananmen Square crackdown, and then basically and you can read interviews with them basically saying like, you're not going to find a Chinese Gorbachev, like we've got our plan in place, we're going to keep this together, we have a very conscious way that we're going to kind of liberalize certain things. And I guess the argument being that she has in place more restrictions than some of his predecessors, but he's also gotten much more back into a Marxist argument and a developmentalist argument. But that at the end of the day, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao said it would be a silent rise. They didn't say, a peaceful rise. They didn't say that was going to last into perpetuity. There was going to be a time when China would play the role it's obviously would play in the world again because of its scale. None of them ever said that China was a non-communist state. And none of them questioned the relationship between the party and private business and delivery. So with the exception of like some things like Belt and Road, which is Xi's like major defining foreign policy initiative and is hugely significant and, in some ways actually really great, in other ways really hyped, and in other ways clearly it has some threats and problems to it. I mean, I don't really know one way or another, certainly not from like the warmongering hype perspective, but also not from like, whoa, China's got a revolutionary leader again. I don't really know if it's that different, to be honest. I think it seems like to me kind of rebranding of basically some pretty deep Deng Xiaoping continuities.
Just so we're clear on what we're saying, like, I don't think that Xi's a kind of radical break from that tradition either.
Yeah.
I just think that China is obviously, it's, the most massive country. It's very important. And I think we should just treat it and take it a little bit more. I'm not saying us as this group of 4 people. I'm just saying in general, we should treat it like much more seriously as something to, one, be interacting with, but 2, to like take a little bit more effort to like really study how those systems are working, because I do agree that like there are 2 trends, right, that are growing out of this, and China definitely represents one of them. And it's a huge mistake for us to sort of let this kind of dumber versions of this argument to play out over a more serious conversation about what China is.
Yeah, 100%.
I'd also say with regard to the Mark Ames thing, it's like, I think it depends on context, right? Like if I'm talking to my Republican uncle, then like I think 100% of my commentary on it would be, wow, all this belligerence towards China is stupid. Don't do that.
Right.
But since I'm not talking to my Republican uncle, I'm on TMBS and smart leftists watch this, then like I want to have some nuance that like wouldn't really belong in that other conversation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And again, I think one of the things that's actually, and part of the reason why the American deep state, and I will say that unashamedly, part of the reason there's such a deep freak out about China, and paradoxically, maybe some of the reasons you can also incentivize more of that rigor, is like, it isn't a country that the United States can just bully.
No, yeah.
And it's not and that isn't the metric. I mean, there's a lot of places that, regardless of whether it's a heroic experiment that the US is trying to destroy, or even just like some, asshole that has gotten on the wrong side of the United States, the primary metric is US hegemonic power. That's actually not, I mean, it could be, because the United States is still by far massively the most powerful military force in the world. And as people who are, affiliated with Chinese policy making will constantly remind you that, China contributes to peacekeeping operations while the United States contributes to, terrorist groups and guerrilla wars and, and so on. But, at the end, so those caveats are important. But at the end of the day, I mean, the United States is simply not in that type of relationship with China. And you can totally see, I mean, the incredible arrogance of U.S. policymakers who really did think, on one hand, while totally selling out their own workers, and I won't belabor it because we got to keep it moving, but I really would say it's very important, particularly with the woke stuff. Don't let people who are demonizing China steal the argument on repatriation and production supply chains. Because not only is that the right policy, that's a policy that everybody should want. And we're seeing it increasingly actually across Asia. One of the kind of funny things is I've been dipping into like more of the Asian press. And it is interesting that like in their own hegemonic balancing, like they don't have, like, they're like, yeah, of course China's fucking lying about it. Like, we know that, we live here. Like, of course they're full of it, right? And of course we want our own resiliency in supply chains. Just like, by the way, the reason that China has actually had a lot of accomplishments, yes, there is broader industrialization, but it's been built more durably, I think, in some ways. And that's because China has aggressively protected domestic industries and fed domestic companies, which is great, and which is what everybody should do. And it's an enormous accomplishment of the Chinese Communist Party. So don't, I do sometimes see, it's like I get to the border of like, yes, reject the xenophobia, warmongering, and stupidity, but like, don't start saying that criticizing PNTR with China like isn't woke or multicultural or something, because that's where woke stuff just starts to become silly and embarrassing, and won't, it just doesn't have the capacity to talk about really serious things that we're going to be seriously dealing with over the next, couple of decades. And, the repatriation stuff, I would love to see a dual message of like, yeah, we're going to make our supply chains resilient. In fact, cyber rattling against China now is fucking insane. They could just turn off the tap. Right. And also, thirdly, we need to figure out a bunch of areas that we can partner with China, like obviously ecology.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.